Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. My name is Yusuke Takagi. Today I'm serving as a moderator, and this is a GRIPS forum with distinguished journalists from the Philippines, Ms. Marites Dañguilan Vitug. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have her as a speaker of this GRIPS forum. Actually, before joining us today, she came to GRIPS twice as a visiting scholar, and each time she has come, she published a book. So, and she will talk about the latest book about Philippines' foreign policy and politics towards China. And aside from the two books, of course, she's a seasoned journalist, and the name tells many things. Actually, her nickname is Mother among the journalists. So whenever I meet a journalist in the Philippines, everybody calls her as Mother. And now you know what's the role she's playing in the Philippine journalism. And aside from that, of course, Rappler, she's working for as an editor-at-large. The founding CEO, Maria Ressa, received the Nobel laureates, and which shows her team nobody could stop her team as a Rappler, and everybody knows President Duterte was very much brutal against journalism in the Philippines, but despite that, Marites and Maria Ressa and the other friends and the co-workers there fought against kind of democratic backsliding in the country. And the topic she's talking about is actually Unrequited Love by former president toward another president in China. And she covered this issue for almost more than 10 years, I think. And her second latest book is about Rock Solid, is about Philippine diplomacy bringing China into the permanent court of arbitration. And that was a very interesting and exciting story. And after publication of that book, she realized the kind of frustrated reality that the successive government didn't follow the kind of diplomatic achievement President Aquino's administration won. So, but that was the beginning of her book, the latest book on Philippine diplomacy and also politics towards China. So without further ado, let me invite Ms. Marites Vitug to the floor. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here this afternoon, and thank you, Professor Yusuke Takagi, and to GRIPS for inviting me to speak to you today. You may not know this, but I think Yusuke mentioned it. I spent 2 months here in 2023 in a room close to that of Professor Takagi's, one with a beautiful view, and it even had a sofa. It was there in that room where I wrote the book, which is the subject of my talk today. The title of the book is Unrequited Love, Duterte's China Embrace. During those 2 months, it was April and May of 2023, whenever I felt my brain squeezed dry after hours of writing, I would lie on the sofa and stare at the ceiling. Those were very productive moments. I always have fond memories of GRIPS, and today it's like coming home. And thank you again, GRIPS and Takagi-sensei, for your wonderful support. Now, just to give you a brief outline of my talk, first I will chronicle the highlights of President Rodrigo Duterte's pivot to China, from the announcement of his dependence on China to the last months of his presidency, when China failed to deliver its promised loans. So here's the flow of my talk. Second, I will look at why Duterte made this foreign policy shift, his leadership style, and his relationship with President Xi Jinping. And for some context, I will talk briefly about the difference between President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and during Arroyo's time, it was when the golden age of relations with China began, and I will compare this with President Duterte's. Then I will take you on a helicopter ride over the flashpoints in the West Philippine Sea and what Duterte did to appease China. And fifth is an important question: what is the impact of Duterte's pivot to China? I will try to answer this briefly. And the final part of my talk is a discussion of the foreign policy of the current President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. So since the book has been released in July this year, some people have asked me, so why did you choose the title Unrequited Love? Jokingly, I would say, so that the public would think it's a romance novel, thinking if it's such, then they would buy the book. But seriously speaking, the real reason is that former President Duterte carried a 6-year love affair with China, with public declarations of love, not only for China, but for Xi Jinping. Rarely do we hear heads of state declare their love for other heads of state. So it was surprising to see Duterte, a macho man, and in his personal life, a serial lover, woo China so openly. So he wore his foreign policy on his sleeve. He also tended to be clingy. He talked about needing China and showing obsequiousness. So let me begin, and I'll take you back in time to October 20, 2016. This day stands out in many people's memory. It was a cool autumn day in Beijing when President Duterte went on a state visit to China, and he made a major announcement to a crowd of Filipino and Chinese businessmen attending a trade and investment forum. At the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, he said in his usual incoherent way, and you can read part of his meandering speech here, but the essence was he was separating the Philippines from the US. So he said, so I come here and say I'm not asking for free, but if I could, China would find in his heart to help us in our needs, then we will remember you for all time. And then he went on, and the last paragraph, he said, I announce my separation from the United States, both the military and economics. I have separated from them, and so I will be dependent on you for all times. But do not worry, we will also help you as you help us. So when we heard this, the ground shifted beneath our feet. It was the most dramatic twist in foreign policy that stunned many. Because in the Philippines, for more than 70 years, the Philippines' foreign policy was anchored on its strategic relations with the US since the forging of the Mutual Defense Treaty in 1951. So in October of 2016, on the 4th month of Duterte's presidency, began the China pivot. So 2 of his cabinet members who traveled with Duterte to Beijing had to do some damage control. They did not expect this announcement. So Economic Planning Secretary Ernesto Perña and Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez immediately came up with a statement explaining what Duterte meant. So a few hours after Duterte unleashed those words, Perña and Dominguez issued a statement saying that while Asian economic integration was long overdue, that did not mean that the Philippines was turning its back on the West. In many occasions after this visit to Beijing, Duterte continued to extol China on various occasions, openly expressing his affection for the country and its leader. So you can see here, on April 9, 2018, Duterte said, I simply love Xi Jinping. He understands my problem and he is willing to help. More than anybody else at this time of our national life, I need China. And then on May 31, 2019, swept by his fondness for our giant neighbor, he declared, I love China. So after the state visit, there was a triumphant note in the air as Duterte's cabinet men announced China's pledge of $24 billion in investment and soft loans for a long list of major infrastructure projects for Duterte's grandiose build, build, build program. So this included mega railway projects, the biggest of which was planned to be in Mindanao, where the president came from, a dam, an irrigation project, and bridges. It also had a digital component, a crime surveillance system. This was close to Duterte's heart, so I'll talk a bit about this. This project would have led to China's ubiquitous presence in our digital systems. It was called the Safe Philippines Project. Basically, this project would expand and strengthen the Davao model in monitoring and fighting crime and replicate this in cities in Metro Manila. It's called the Davao model because during Sara Duterte's time as mayor, Sara is our current vice president, she hired IBM to install a digital surveillance system to monitor crime. So after this, after IBM finished its contract, the local government under Sara bought Chinese-made cameras and surveillance system. So the Safe Philippine project proposed under the President Duterte's time would use Huawei facial recognition technology, among others. The plan was to install 12,000 CCTV cameras in Metro Manila and Davao. The cameras would be located in roads, in public squares, business districts, residential areas, and the goal was to reduce crime. But the Senate opposed it because of national security concerns. Safe Philippines involved gathering of data from millions of Filipinos, which could land in Chinese hands. Because as we know, the National Intelligence Law of China requires that organizations like Huawei and the contractor of the project cooperate with Chinese intelligence agencies. So despite the loan agreement with China and the high-profile launching of the project, Safe Philippines never took off, thankfully. One reason was delayed funding, which could have partly been caused by the pandemic. As for the railways, the Mindanao Railway Project and the Philippine National Railway's South Long Haul and Subic-Clark Railway, funding was supposed to come from China loans amounting to $4.9 billion, but this never came. So what accounted for this? Why did the loans not push through? Chinese economy had slowed down because of the pandemic, and questions on the viability of these projects emerged. Also, the different political systems of Beijing and Manila contributed to the delay in loan approvals. When I interviewed a finance official, he told me there was a mismatch comparing the transparent and open processes of the Philippines to China's tight one-party control. The Philippines, in other words, did not share the values of the lender state. Moreover, the Philippines has had shorter experience in dealing with Chinese loans. As an aid recipient, the Philippines is more accustomed to dealing with Japan's aid agencies as well as Western countries. In 2022, the country's debt to China accounted for 4.5% of the total debt, while that of Japan's was twice as large at 9.5% of the total debt. So until the last months of Duterte's presidency, China did not act on the loan applications of the Philippines. Thus, our finance secretary withdrew them. So 6 years later, by the time Duterte stepped down, only 3 of the long list of projects came to fruition. This is Kaliwa Dam in the provinces of Rizal and Quezon. Construction is still ongoing. The second project is the Chico River Irrigation Project. This has already been completed during the last year of Duterte's term. The third China-funded project is a bridge linking Davao, this is Duterte's home province, to Samal Island. This was the last loan of China to the Philippines, approved only during the last months of Duterte's term. So it was a sort of a thank you to Duterte. This project, however, has been questioned because of environmental issues, but construction has been going on. However, China did give the Philippines gifts 3 bridges in Metro Manila in the early months of Duterte's term. Then NEDA Secretary Perña described this as come-ons to entice the Philippines to borrow from China. But in the area of trade flourished as China became the Philippines' top trading partner, but it favored China as Manila registered a huge trade deficit. So what drove Duterte's pivot to China? Let's look at a number of factors. One is really the milieu in which Duterte grew up in Davao, where he developed friendships with migrants from mainland China. These are businessmen and investors, as well as Chinese Filipino businessmen. And number 2, he really did not like America because of personal and official reasons. Duterte claims to have been supposedly mistreated by an arrogant U.S. immigration officer at the Los Angeles airport when he was on an official trip as member of Congress. He was detained in a room in the Los Angeles airport. He was so angry, he just left the room and asked to leave America on the first flight available. When he was president, the U.S. was very critical of Duterte's war on drugs and his atrocious human rights record. Third, Duterte claims to have socialist leanings, saying he was influenced by the late founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines, Jose Maria Sison, who was his teacher in college. Fourth, China, of course, for pragmatic reasons, was a rich source of loans and investments, and Beijing kept quiet about Duterte's violent war on drugs. China supported Duterte's anti-drug campaign by building drug rehabilitation centers in Mindanao and Central Luzon. These were funded by tycoons from the mainland as well as the Chinese government. Mindanao was favored. 3 of the 4 drug rehab centers were in Mindanao. Now let me talk a bit about Duterte's leadership style. Duterte did not discuss a major foreign policy shift with his cabinet. Not one cabinet meeting, I am told, during our interviews, was dedicated to discussing his foreign policy. And what was the impact of this foreign policy shift on economic and security arenas? There was no such discussion because Duterte was not a consultative type of leader. It was up to the concerned departments like Foreign Affairs, Defense, Finance, Economic Planning to implement Duterte's embrace and appease China policy. It was also up to the concerned department heads to make sense of Duterte's off-the-cuff remarks. As you know, during Duterte's time, cabinet meetings usually started at night, like 7 p.m., and ended in the small hours. So they were unstructured, and Duterte liked to talk, and he couldn't be reined in by any of his cabinet members. He was an autocratic leader, and he acted unilaterally. One issue that wasn't talked about in the cabinet was the interest rate on China's loans, which was higher than those of Japan and had shorter repayment period. There was no such discussion. But because Duterte said the country needed to borrow loans from China, the government went ahead and borrowed funds from China's Exim Bank. It was only Secretary Perña who made this issue public, and he said that the Philippines had to borrow from China to diversify the Philippine sources of loans. On the personal front, relations between Duterte and Xi blossomed. Xi came to the Philippines on a state visit, the first by a Chinese president in 13 years. Duterte visited China 5 times during his 6-year term, compared to his predecessor, President Benigno Aquino III, who visited China only twice. And Duterte met with Xi 8 times, including Xi's visits to the Philippines and their bilateral meetings in APEC summits. So Duterte was able to gain concessions from Xi amid the backdrop of tensions in the West Philippine Sea. It was like asking your tenant for favorable terms, even if you owned the house. So 1, China did not block the building of a beaching ramp in Pag-asa Island, or T2, the first major improvement the island had seen in years. So this beaching ramp allowed Philippine Navy and Coast Guard vessels to dock near the island. Number 2, Filipino fishermen were allowed to return to Scarborough Shoal, but at the mercy of the Chinese Coast Guard. And they were allowed only outside the lagoon. A Scarborough Shoal has a lagoon where you can find the rich fish stocks. Duterte, however, lost in one big way. In the country's pursuit of oil and gas in Reed Bank, a feature which China claims, but which lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Until the end of Duterte's term, China was insisting that the Philippines should only drill for oil and gas jointly with China, not with any other country. It was a red line, and Duterte agreed to accede to this red line. And I will talk more about this later. So now, before I continue, I would like to situate Duterte for some context. So in the post-Marcos Sr. era, while Duterte was the only president who openly and unabashedly embraced China, it was President Gloria Arroyo who really sought closer relations with Beijing. During her 9 years in office, she began what she described as the golden age of relations between Manila and Beijing. She attracted Chinese aid and investments, but at the same time stayed friendly to America. She visited the U.S. 5 times when she was president, compared to Duterte, who never set foot in the U.S. It was during Arroyo's time that the Philippines joined the U.S.-led coalition of the willing in the war against Iraq in 2003. But she had to withdraw when a Filipino overseas worker in Iraq was taken hostage and his life was at stake. So her approach was different from that of Duterte's, as Arroyo tried to balance relations with China and the U.S. So for her, China was a source of loans and investments. And during Arroyo's time, a major investment pushed through the privatization of the Philippines power grid. In 2007, it was the largest privatization project in the country's history at the time. Years later, the Senate would raise questions about China's 40% stake in the country's loan transmission line and its implications on national security. And also at the time of Arroyo, there was little friction between Manila and Beijing because in the West Philippine Sea, it mostly had to do with illegal fishing. Unlike in Duterte's time, when he was president, the maritime tension between Manila and Beijing had already built up. And the Philippines also won its maritime case against China in 2016. So Xi Jinping described bilateral relations between Manila and Beijing as the rainbow after the rain, coming after the stormy relations during President Noynoy Aquino's term. On the security front, Duterte suspended the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement, or VFA, with the U.S. in 2020. He said he intended to scrap it. However, on July 2021, Duterte decided to keep the VFA after the U.S. donated millions of doses of COVID-19 mRNA vaccines. This eclipsed China's donation. The exchange was vaccines for VFA. That was the only moment in his presidency that Duterte softened on America. He thanked the U.S. and said he would consider visiting Washington, but this never happened. Now, on the security side, I'll talk about the 5 flashpoints in the West Philippine Sea. These are Ayungin Shoal, or Second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, Sandy Cay, Recto Bank, or Reed Bank, and Escoda, or Sabina Shoal. So why should we even care about these rocks and reefs in the distant waters? Why should other countries care about it too? Apart from the Philippines having sovereign rights over these features, West Philippine Sea, which is a part of the South China Sea, is part of a major trade route which brings in billions of dollars. Also, in the West Philippine Sea is a source of food fish stocks for many of the fishermen in the area. So now let's take a helicopter ride over the flashpoints. This is Second Thomas Shoal or Ayungin Shoal. It is the weakest link. If you've been watching the news, this is where tension always happens. And even during Duterte's presidency, tension already began as early as 2018 when the PLA Navy hovered over a Philippine Navy rubber boat on a resupply mission to BRP Sierra Madre. And this happened several times later. And I'll have to show you Sierra Madre, which you may be familiar with. This is a World War II vintage ship that the government deliberately grounded on Second Thomas Shoal to serve as its outpost. You must be familiar with this photograph, a miserable-looking ship that looks like it will collapse anytime soon. Anyway, 5 years into the Duterte administration, the harassment continued, and it peaked in 2021 when the China Coast Guard used water cannons to shoot out powerful bursts of water, and the Philippine boats were forced to return back. And these harassments continued, and at the time, Defense Secretary Lorenzana said, and I quote, "Slowly, the Chinese will take hold of BRP Sierra Madre," end of quote. We're seeing this happen today. China wants to wear down the Philippines until it sees an opportunity to take over Sierra Madre. The good news is we have reached a temporary reprieve. Manila and Beijing have agreed to keep the peace in Second Thomas Shoal, but details of this agreement have not been made public. The second flashpoint is Scarborough Shoal. Again, you may have read about this in the news. A bit of background. China seized this Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012 after a tense standoff. Since then, the Chinese Coast Guards had never left. Scarborough is part of the Philippines EEZ. It was declared by the International Arbitral Tribunal in 2016 as a traditional common fishing ground for Filipinos, Chinese, and Vietnamese. So far, China has not reclaimed Scarborough Shoal as it has done to other features, wherein China created artificial islands, just like what they did to Mischief Reef, which is part of the Philippines EEZ, but was grabbed by China in 1995. So there was a time in Duterte's term that our Philippine Navy saw Coast Guard ships and other vessels suspected to be dredges close to Scarborough Shoal. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry denied that they were constructing an artificial island. Even Duterte was bothered. He said it was unsettling to read intelligence reports on a lot of barges at Scarborough Shoal. Reclaiming Scarborough Shoal was a red line for both the U.S. and the Philippines. Scarborough Shoal is very close to a province called Zambales, a coastal province called Zambales, where fishing villages abound. Any Chinese outpost in Scarborough Shoal would tighten China's grip over the South China Sea. And fishing rights is a major issue in this shoal. In late 2016, after Duterte's state visit to Beijing, he announced that the Filipino fishermen would be able to fish in Scarborough, but it turned out, only outside, not within the lagoon where I earlier mentioned the rich fish stocks were. So the next flashpoint is Sandy Cay. It's just one of 3 sandbars close to Pag-asa or Tito Island, and Pag-asa is occupied by the Philippines. Sandy Cay is a potential flashpoint because it lies between Pag-asa and Subi Reef, which is controlled by China. Subi Reef is now a huge military base in the Spratly Islands, controlled by the Chinese. They have been docking Chinese ships, and military planes had been using it as a base. The structures on Subi Reef are visible from Pag-asa Island, and at night, residents of Pag-asa could see the lights from the artificial island. The the next flashpoint, this is Reed Bank, or we call it Recto Bank. Again, it lies within our EEZ, but China insists it is theirs. This is the shoal or the island wherein, which is very rich with oil and gas. Our Energy Department estimated Reed Bank to contain a potential of 165 million barrels of oil and more than 3 billion cubic feet of gas. So with the looming energy crisis in the Philippines, this becomes even more important. The sad part is that in 2011, China stopped a legitimate Philippine geological survey of the area. That's why this was one of the reasons then President Aquino decided to bring China to court in 2013. So during Duterte's time, there were negotiations with the Philippines and China to jointly explore for oil and gas, but this failed because China didn't want to agree to a service contract. In the Philippines, a service contract is a standard partnership of the Philippines with companies that apply for exploration. However, for China, a service contract means that it has to acknowledge Philippine sovereign rights over Reed Bank and has to comply with Philippine laws, including paying taxes. China also wanted a 50-50 or 51-49% revenue sharing agreement. This was against the Philippine Constitution's provision of a 60-40% sharing agreement. So eventually, these negotiations failed. What's interesting or intriguing is that in the last months of Duterte's presidency, when a British company and its Philippine partner were about to start surveying Reed Bank, Duterte announced, you can read the quote, he said, "I won't name names, but someone from China reminded me that we have an agreement about a joint development at the Recto Bank. But they heard that someone else," this is a British company in the Philippines, "was coming in. Somebody whispered to me, telling me not to do that and to honor our original contract." And this person, whoever he was, told Duterte he threatened to send soldiers to Reed Bank just in case the Philippines did it on its own. So when Duterte said this in March 2022, there was actually no such agreement between Manila and Beijing because negotiations, as I said, had failed. In fact, the talks would be terminated in a matter of weeks. So there was no such agreement. Still, the Energy Department ordered the Philippine company and its British partner to stop the survey of Reed Bank. The ships eventually moved out, so the exploration or the survey never took place. This is the last flashpoint, Escoda Shoal or Sabina Shoal. It's actually the newest. This used to be a quiet feature, and it became a center of attention, and it flared into a hotspot months ago when the Philippines sent a ship to guard Escoda Shoal. Escoda Shoal is the usual takeoff point of the resupply missions of the Navy and Coast Guard when they went to Sierra Madre. But Escoda Shoal is also very close to Reed Bank, which you saw earlier, which is rich in oil and gas. But something rattled the Chinese because in April of this year, the Philippine Coast Guard quietly docked its biggest ship, Magbanwa, which is manufactured and given by, paid for by Japan. Magbanwa was docked near Escoda Shoal because the Philippines wanted to beef up its presence in the West Philippine Sea. Because there were suspicions that China had plans to reclaim Escoda, and it also wanted to keep watch over China's illegal fishing. But eventually, Magbanwa had to leave because after a series of storms, the Coast Guard could not resupply the troops there with food and water. The rains didn't stop, and the weather was very stormy. So some of the 60-plus personnel on board the ship were dehydrated. But the most devastating was that China Coast Guard rammed the ship leaving a big hole in Magbanua. But this is a new development. It was the first time under the Marcos administration and in recent years that a Philippine vessel was stationed in the West Philippine Sea for months. The usual practice was to conduct short-term patrols, usually for about 2 weeks, after which the vessels leave and then wait for the next leg of the patrol. So having taken you on a helicopter ride over the flashpoints, the next question is, what did Duterte do to appease China in these contentious waters, and what did this mean for the Philippines? We recently learned that in 2016, Duterte agreed to secret or confidential agreements like a temporary special arrangement in Scarborough wherein Filipino fishermen can fish except in the lagoon. So this was the so-called temporary special arrangement. Another secret agreement that Duterte agreed to was that the armed forces, Coast Guard, and the Philippine government vessels and aircraft should not enter the 12 nautical mile territorial sea and corresponding airspace. What did this mean for the Philippines? It meant that Duterte waived Philippine sovereignty, although temporarily, over Scarborough Shoal, and he also waived the rights of the poor Filipino fishermen, although temporarily, to fish within the lagoon of Scarborough Shoal. In Second Thomas Shoal, or Ayungin, Duterte had a verbal understanding with China that the Philippines would not transport construction materials to this aging ship. This meant it was okay with Duterte to let Sierra Madre eventually collapse, losing the Philippine outpost in Second Thomas Shoal. In Sandy Cay, Duterte aborted a Philippine Navy mission that was planning on building a nipa hut or for a shelter for the fishermen in the area. At the time, Chinese fishing ships accompanied by the PLA Navy frigates kept hovering in the area, and these vessels prevented a ship of the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources from approaching the area. So the Philippine Navy was already planning a mission to build a shelter, but Duterte had this mission aborted. So what is the impact of Duterte's pivot? What is its impact to the Philippines? I will focus on a few subjects: the impact on our national conversation, on the rule of law, and on politics. During Duterte's term, he emboldened pro-China voices to cohere and to emerge. During his presidency, a small group of pro-China academics and media commentators surfaced. They were active on Facebook, and they echoed Chinese propaganda and promoted pro-Duterte content. When Marcos Jr. became president and abandoned the China pivot, this group became critical also of Marcos. Today, Duterte, joined by a few politicians, like the sister of the president, Senator Amy Marcos, they continue to amplify China's propaganda and disinformation narratives. The targets of disinformation are Marcos and the government officials who are outspoken against China. So what is the message of China? The war narrative has been the most pervasive. China says that the Philippines, when it stands up to China, it would lead the Philippines to war. Of course, this is a false choice. This has been Duterte's line to appease China since he was president. And the latest target of China's disinformation is a coalition of civil society groups called Atin Ito, or This Is Ours, which organize unprecedented humanitarian missions to Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal. According to China, in their disinformation campaign, this coalition is funded by the US and Philippine governments. This is false. Second, China reinforced Duterte's disregard for the rule of law. During Duterte's presidency, the government took shortcuts to speed up the building of infrastructure projects funded by China. During the pandemic, Duterte and his men flouted the rules. Duterte's guards and some cabinet members were the first to be vaccinated thanks to China vaccines. This caused an uproar since they came ahead of the health frontliners, the nurses and the doctors who were supposed to be the priority. Duterte himself was vaccinated with Sinopharm, a Chinese vaccine, which was not approved by our health department. When it came to suppliers of personal protective equipment and masks, Chinese firms were favored at the expense of Philippine companies, which offered lower prices. Third impact is that China has influenced our politics. China's Communist Party has forged partnerships with the PDP Laban, the ruling party during Duterte's time. Although Vice President Sara, whose photo you can see here, is not a member of the PDP Laban, she has not publicly criticized China's violent behavior in the West Philippine Sea. She has refused to comment whenever she is asked about China's provocative acts in the West Philippine Sea. But national polls show her to be among the most popular national candidates in the Philippines, and she is likely to run for president in 2028, and like her father, she may shift relations back to Beijing. The only thing that would stop her from running for president if there is a successful impeachment movement in the Philippines, if she is convicted, then she would not be able to run for public office. But as of now, she can run for public office, and she is one of the leading contenders for the 2028 presidential elections. Now I'll go to Marcos's and the present foreign policy of the current president. So when Marcos became president in 2022, he pushed back against Beijing, and he has won support domestically and in the West. So many people are wondering why did Marcos shift foreign policy to the West? I think apart from other reasons like he studied in the US, he has an affinity with the United States, he studied in the UK, so he has that affinity with the West, and he had also a love-hate relationship since it was the U.S. which brought his father to Hawaii. But why did he shift to the West? And I think a big influence was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because this happened months before Marcos was sworn into office. Because in his inauguration speech, Marcos made no mention of South China Sea or of China. It was Ukraine that was on his mind. And this was his quote: "If the great powers draw the wrong lessons from the ongoing tragedy in Ukraine, the same dark prospect of conflict will spread to our part of the world." So eventually, Marcos would meet with Ukraine President Zelensky in Manila in June this year. And we have seen the developments wherein Marcos has granted the U.S. access to 4 more military bases. He was building on the measures to strengthen the alliance since the 2014 U.S.-Philippine Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Also on Marcos's watch, he has overseen the largest ever joint military exercises between the two countries, which have included new maritime drills and, for the first time, the participation of the Philippine Coast Guard. Marcos has visited America 4 times in 2 years, and in 2023, he became the first Philippine president to set foot in the Indo-Pacific Command headquarters in Hawaii. For their part, U.S. officials have consistently expressed support for the Philippines and criticism of Beijing each time China harasses Philippine vessels. And Marcos has been consistently underscoring the upholding of international law, particularly the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, to settle maritime disputes. And one of the pillars of the Marcos strategy has been to be very transparent about clashes with China in the South China Sea, instead of the silence or selective disclosure that prevailed during the Duterte administration. Now, every time there's a clash or there's a skirmish, Manila calls out Beijing as a bully and it pushes back, and it rallies support at home and abroad. And the Philippine Coast Guard has embedded local as well as international media in its patrols and resupply missions. The worst attack by China took place in June. This was the most horrifying confrontation we have seen when Chinese Coast Guard personnel boarded a Philippine Navy rubber boat, and they were wielding pickaxes, knives, and improvised spears. They ransacked the Philippine boats, looted firearms, and hammered the outboard motors, windshields, and communication equipment. So in the confrontation, a Filipino sailor's thumb got sliced off by a sharp piece of metal. This signaled a significant escalation from China's usual maneuverings of shadowing, blocking, and firing water cannons. But for now, Marcos' approach has been successful in reaching domestic and international audiences. Let's look at a survey which was done in June this year by Pulse Asia, wherein 76% of the Filipinos agreed that the Marcos administration should continue asserting the country's sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea, and 51% believed that it can be done by strengthening alliances and conducting joint military patrols and exercises. And these continue until today. And the majority of those surveyed, 74%, wanted the Philippines to work with the United States. Only 5% of the Filipinos favored working with China. In terms of international support, Marcos has galvanized a lot of support for the Philippines. Countries like Canada, France, and New Zealand want to negotiate visiting forces agreements similar to existing arrangement we have with Australia, Japan, and the US. Recently, South Korea and the Philippines elevated their relationship to that of a comprehensive strategic relationship. And belatedly, in Asia, India and South Korea threw their support behind the Philippines' 2016 legal victory against China. On the multilateral front, two formations have emerged: a high-level trilateral cooperation among Japan, the Philippines, and the US, focused on economic and military cooperation, and a quadrilateral forum of defense ministers, including Australia's, aimed at deepening security cooperation through joint military exercises. Despite all this, the bad news is this has not changed China's behavior. But Manila and Beijing have been ramping up diplomatic efforts, and as I mentioned earlier, both sides have reached a temporary agreement to reduce volatility in the resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal. However, later clashes in Sabina Shoal have demonstrated the difficulty of sustaining the peace. But Beijing's provocations so far have not met the red line set by Marcos, which is the killing of a Filipino citizen by a willful act. But this has raised the specter of heightened danger. Could the next violent incident trigger the Philippines to invoke its mutual defense treaty with the United States? Marcos has called for de-escalation, telling Filipino troops not to resort to the use of force or intimidation. And Marcos, in a recent speech, reminded Beijing, without mentioning its name, that this should not be mistaken for acquiescence. So, meantime, there are looming questions, and I would like to share this with you. So it's really up to the Philippines to decide what kind of help does it want from the United States. And in this mutual defense treaty, can the Philippines and the US already invoke Article 3, which means consultation, active consultation between the foreign ministers or their deputies whenever, in their opinion, there is a threat from an external armed attack in the Pacific. And this question needs to be addressed by the Philippine government. What is the long-term strategy of the Philippines in protecting its sovereign rights over the West Philippine Sea? The answers to all these questions are worth watching, and I leave them with you today. Thank you very much for listening.